I don't know about you, but I'm in Arizona, and the weather is like finally starting to cool down a little bit, a lot actually. Even like a month ago, it was nearing 100, and now it's dropped down into the 70s. And the reason I bring this up is because when the weather cools down and the seasons start to change a little bit, it's time to pull out those cozy books. I think this year has been rather stressful for a lot of people, including me. And so I am choosing to embrace the holiday season for all it has to offer, including revisiting some classics on my shelf that really put me in that kind of cozy, warm fall season, Christmas season kind of mood. So without further ado, I wanted to go through 5, technically 6 books that I think you should get into if you haven't tried before. They're not necessarily like set during the fall. They're not necessarily about Christmas or anything like that. But I think they're like best enjoyed like in a chair with a blanket on, fireplace going, candles lit, that kind of thing. These aren't necessarily happy books either. The comfort I'm describing here is not necessarily coming from like the good vibes in the books, at least plot wise. But if you're someone like me who, when I'm out of sorts, I actually tend to gravitate more towards like sad music and sad books and movies, this might be up your alley. So with all that said, my little preamble or whatever, here's some books I think you might enjoy in the next few months. First thing I'm going to recommend is the Monk and Robot series, which consists of a Psalm for the Wild Built and a Prayer for the Crowned Shy. These books are written by Becky Chambers, who you might know from The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and its sequels, which are part of the Wayfarer series. Becky Chambers has this talent where she can create this whole fantastical sci-fi world and still have everything within that world feel like tangible and real, and her stories are so centered on people and relationships and that kind of thing that sometimes you're like, why did she even have to build this world for it to live in? But the world she built around it enhance that experience and can sort of give these stories a metaphorical sandbox for them to sit in, if that makes sense. The Monk and Robot series is about a tea monk, which I'm not sure if that's something that has existed historically, but basically this person who travels from village to village in this sort of like nature-filled world or nature-centric world that this series is set in, just selling tea. They're essentially like a traveling monk barista kind of thing. Along the way, if I'm remembering correctly, in the first one, she runs into this robot, and they just sort of develop a rapport with each other. And when I say science fiction, I don't mean like spaceships and aliens and anything like blowing up. There's no lasers involved. But Becky Chambers does use this setting that she's created to sort of draw parallels between the real world and this world, and to kind of just talk about how we treat each other as human beings and treat life in general, whether it's human or animal or plant or anything else. In the Wayfarer series, Becky Chambers has tackled race and gender and identity politics, and there's a lot of that in these books too. But it's not, I feel at least, that she's doing it in a way that is pretty digestible, and it feels like the story exists outside of that, and it doesn't just serve as like tent post to prop up any sort of ideas that she's trying to put forth. Certainly that's a part of it. But what I'm saying is that if you're someone who's not like me, who's like pretty far on the left, if you're kind of on the other spectrum and you want to kind of meet in the middle a little bit and sort of understand a different perspective that has to do with those topics, these books are a great way to do that, I think. They're super cozy. The fact that the main character is just traveling from town to town selling tea is about as peaceful and idyllic as it gets. I don't know why I'm getting so hung up on kind of the politics of these books, but I guess now that I'm thinking about it from the perspective of like not just me and as someone who maybe has never tried a book like this, I'm like, oh yeah, it might seem a little like lefty, hippie, like propaganda kind of stuff, but it's really not. And honestly, even reading these books for me is like helpful because the main character is non-binary, so they're they them, and At least in the books that I've read, you don't run into those pronouns all the time. In her other books, the pronouns get even wackier because they're like alien species and stuff like that. But with that said, this is a good exercise because I have trans people in my life and non-binary people in my life. And sometimes you like need to just read those pronouns in context of something enough to where it becomes like part of your vernacular and doesn't seem like this little speed bump that you hit every time you have to encounter talking in that language. I'm getting really into the weeds with this shit. It's a good book. They're both really good. I hope she does a third one. In fact, I think she is doing a third one. But yeah, can't recommend these highly enough. I would even throw in the Wayfarer series too into this like cozy book recommendation series. So yeah, A Psalm for the Wild-Built, Prayer for the Crown-Shy, a book for your bookshelf. Check it out. The next book I'm going to recommend is one that I read last year, and frankly, like, there's some books you remember because of the plot and, like, the crazy shit that happens in it, and then there's other books that you remember for the feeling that it gave you, and that's the case with this one, which is Pure Color by Sheila Heti. This book does have a plot. I had to look it up to remember what it was. It has to do with someone who I think is either an artist or an art critic, and they fall into a relationship with someone, which sounds super simple, but this book is super abstract. It's super experimental. There is a lot of kind of like stream of consciousness rambling going on a lot of the time. It really gets into like what life itself means, dating from like its origins to the future to how we exist in our heads compared to how we exist in the real world. And honestly, part of the reason I picked this is because there's a quote in this book that has to do with Christmas lights that has just stuck with me like for fucking ever. I should also say too, there's a lot to do with like death and your ancestors and spirits and that kind of thing in here too. So if you're someone who's into that kind of thing, this is a great book to check out. I wouldn't say this is for everyone, honestly. This is a pretty short book, but even at times I was having a hard time kind of pushing through kind of how like amorphous it is at times, but I definitely think it's worth checking out. So I have the quote on my laptop. It's a lot longer than I remember it being, but at least the part about the Christmas lights, it says, "That winter, walking through her neighborhood, she saw the little red, green, white, blue, purple, and yellow Christmas lights which dotted the porches and were strung across the trees in the front yards of most of her neighbors. They shimmered like the most beautiful stars, just giving off their humble light, their cords curled and mangled, their plastic obvious, but they shimmered like the souls of 1,000,000 long-dead people. That humans felt like adorning a tree with lights at Christmas time made her think that an intuition of some other realm wasn't completely gone from us, that humans still felt something, that there was still something to honor." And it goes on for a while after that, but there are these kind of just passages in this book that are just kind of like observations about humanity and like the quirky things we do and what it means to fall in love with another person and how you inherit things from the people that raise you. And it's a lot, and especially a lot to be contained in like roughly 200 pages. But yeah, if you want to kind of like get into your feelings and, I don't know, bask in what it means to be alive, which we should all do from time to time, good shit. Try this one for sure. Also, what a cover. It's so simple, but that shade of green is just like perfect. The next book I'm going to recommend similarly falls into the category of me not remembering what it was about, but really liking it anyway. And that is Amrita by Banana Yoshimoto. I've recommended Banana Yoshimoto on this channel 1,000,000 times before, so I'm not going to get too into kind of who she is and what her whole deal is, but if you read her before, likely if you have, it was Kitchen, since that's like her most popular novel. This is definitely something worth getting into. The first 2-3 books that I showed you were all novellas, basically, or close to being a novella. And a lot of the time, Banana Yoshimoto's work is a novella. Kitchen's really short. The actual book of Kitchen is 2 books in one. Like, it's Kitchen, and then I think the second book is called Moonlight Shadow, and they're kind of packaged together. Amrita is not a novella. That is some thick stuff right here. Basic premise of this one is that a woman in her early 20s loses her sister to suicide, and in the wake of that tragedy, she has an accident and it's amnesia, basically. And so the book is about her regaining her memory and the interaction she has with the rest of her family. There's also some kind of like mystical stuff that goes on in here. I think one of her family members or friends is like a clairvoyant, and that factors into this as well. I read this book at the very beginning of the pandemic. I was in community college for a hot second, even though I already have a degree. I don't know what the fuck I was doing. But I remember coming home from those classes and reading this on the couch, and as the news of the pandemic kind of unfolded in front of our eyes, this was a book that kind of gave me some solace and was something to look forward to in the middle of all that gnarly, insane business that we dealt with for a while. And since we are, at least in my country, dealing with some gnarly, insane weirdness again, this is maybe some good escapism to run into if you need to like worry about someone else's problems for a bit instead of your own. This is my third recommendation, if you count Monk and Robot as one recommendation. The next couple that I'm going to get into are a little bit more accessible, honestly. I probably should have started with those ones, just not to like freak you out entirely. But again, Amrita, it's great. It's not for everyone, but it is for me. It's very on brand for Velicor Ventures. All right, the next one that I'm going to recommend that I think is a little bit more accessible, mostly because it's like a lot of comics and sort of multimedia, mixed media kind of stuff, is Solutions and Other Problems by Allie Brosh. She wrote a book that is the predecessor to this book called Hyperbole and a Half. And if you're someone who has ever dealt with like depression or anxiety or agoraphobia, go pick it up like immediately. It's simultaneously super validating of all those feelings, but also like fucking hilarious. I know this doesn't really look like a person, but like that is supposed to be Allie Brosh. This book and the other one are autobiographical, and you know, she's someone with mental illness and someone who is kind of always struggling to keep herself together and maintain her relationships, and like I'm laughing just looking at these because I haven't looked at them in a while. But you know, she's someone who, I don't know, this is kind of her coping mechanism as far as I can tell, is making these comics. And what I really appreciate about this and its predecessor is just like how vulnerable she's being in her art, especially since it's autobiographical. Some of the stuff she talks about in here is devastating and sad and hilarious all at the same time. And the fact that she's sort of like channeling this anxiety and depression and sort of, I don't know, antisocial tendencies in a way into like like shit that looks like that. I just think it's really cool, and I think it's something that you don't see a lot of, honestly. There's another autobiographical comic that I have somewhere. I don't think it's in this room, but it's called It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth by Zoe Thorogood. That's another example of something like this, where it's sort of like a memoir or an autobiography in comic form. It's very different than this one. It is all the same, sort of talking about someone who has some issues in their life. But the illustration style is completely different. The tone is different. Like, this is really sort of wacky, manic ridiculousness, which I really identify with this completely. It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth is a little bit more, it's just a different flavor of what this is, because it's written by a different person, and no two people's lives are the same. So anyway, this is a great one to get into. I would start with Hyperbole and a Half, just because Allie kind of touches on writing that book and then the aftermath of it in this one. There was also like quite a long jump from that book to this book. She took a break for quite a while and then released this like 6 years later or something like that. But I remember when this was announced, I pre-ordered it immediately because I was so happy that she was back. She also has just like a really interesting Facebook and Reddit presence. Yeah, I don't know. She's an oddball, and the best way I can describe reading this is like you become so attached to her that you start to worry for her as if she were your friend. I think it's a testament to how good the writing and the illustration is, and just her ability to evoke that feeling out of you. But it's also like, oh God, Allie, I hope you're all right. And I do hope she's all right. I think this came out in 2020, so I hope you're doing well, Allie. I know you're not watching this, but yeah, best wishes to you, and hopefully, I don't know, maybe she'll never write another book again, which means that she's like doing better. The last thing I'm going to recommend to you, which is nothing off the beaten path, honestly, but it's just really good, is His Dark Materials by Phillip Pullman. This is a series of 3 books. It is, I think in the UK it's called Northern Lights, but in the US it's called The Golden Compass, is the first book. Second book is The Subtle Knife, and then the third book is, Jesus Christ, why can't I remember it? Amber Spyglass is the third one. This book is set in a world where people have these sort of like physical avatars of themselves that are all animals. And it's about a girl who kind of gets like pulled into this conspiracy by the church and by some like nefarious figures to figure out how to kind of like break into different realities, but they're doing so at the hands of like children and other vulnerable people. These are amazing. They were technically released as like YA books, but the author didn't write them with the intention of them being YA. And I think when you stack this up against something like Harry Potter or Artemis Fowl or any of the other kind of like YA fiction that was popular at the same time that this was, I think this is aged incredibly well, and I think there's like a depth to these books that is not entirely absent in other books, but I think it's just especially pronounced in these. There's also some sequels to this book. There is the La Belle Sauvage, which is a prequel, and then there's a sequel set some years later called The Secret Commonwealth, and both of those are very good as well. This is another pandemic read for me. I was reading it like up to the pandemic, and then I finished it, I think, during like the first month of all that shit that went down. But it's super cozy. It even looks cozy. It's got like the polar bear and the trees and the snow, and it doesn't necessarily all take place in that environment, but if you need something to read, especially if you have kids and you want to read something to them, honestly, this isn't a bad way to go. Some of it's a little scary, some of it's a little intense, but I don't know. I think there's something you can enjoy here as an adult or as a kid. That's about it for now. It's been an incredibly stressful week or so in the States. Yeah. This guy's usually sitting on the shelf over there or back here, but kind of need to take him down and actually hold him today. So anyway, say bye, Bimo. Enjoy your day, enjoy your week. Thanks for watching as always. And yeah, hope to be making a video filled with a little bit more energy next time. So yeah. Bye.